Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Energy Storage in State Energy Efficiency Plans, Lessons from Massachusetts. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and we have with us on today's webinar our host, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director at Clean Energy Group, and we also have with us two guest speakers from Applied Economics Clinic, Liz Stanton and Bryndis Woods. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in using your computer mic and speakers or using a telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can use the orange arrow that you see circled here. That arrow will also work to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit questions and comments throughout the webinar. You can do that by typing them into the questions box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will save about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for a Q&A with the audience. And we'll get to as many questions as we can during that time, but we do expect to have a lot of people on the webinar, and that means probably a lot of questions. So to make sure that we get to your question, do send it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to submit your questions. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the webinar slides within about 24 to 48 hours, probably this afternoon. These materials will also be posted on Clean Energy Group's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd?
Thanks, Samantha. Welcome everybody to the webinar. I think we've gone one slide ahead somehow, but that's okay. Maybe you can back that up. I am wearing two hats today. Usually I'm moderating, and I'm doing that today, but I'm also presenting today. So I'll do my best to cover both of those jobs, and we will do our best collectively to get to as many questions as we can after the presentations. So Samantha, if you could just back up the slides, that would be to the title slide, that would be great. Thanks. So the topic today, as Samantha said, is energy storage and state energy efficiency plans, lessons from Massachusetts. This webinar coincides with the release of our new report on the same topic, which if you've registered and you're here, you've probably got it in your email and hopefully may have had a chance to take a look. If you don't have it, you can download it for free from our website, and we'll give you that information later on. Next slide, please. I want to just say a few words before we start about Clean Energy Group. We are a nonprofit located in Vermont. We are supported by foundations through generous grants for our work, and I want to specifically mention the Barr Foundation and the Merck Family Fund, which supported the work that we're going to be presenting today. Next slide, please. So this I thought was taken out, as we're going to introduce this in the body of the presentation. So next slide, please. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the speakers because I think that's what's next. I'm Todd Olinsky-Paul. I'm a project director here at Clean Energy Group and at the Clean Energy States Alliance, our sister organization. I've focused for the past several years on energy storage, both in deployment and policy development, and particularly on the economics of energy storage. And I work quite a bit with state energy agencies as well as with US DOE and the national laboratories. I'm joined today by Dr. Liz Stanton. She is the clinic director and senior economist, as well as the founder and director of the Applied Economics Clinic. She has worked for more than 17 years as an environmental economist, has authored more than 150 reports, policy studies, white papers, journal articles, and book chapters, and has submitted expert testimony and comments in many states and several federal dockets. With her is Bryndis Woods. She's a researcher also at the Applied Economics Clinic. She's authored more than 20 journal articles, books, book chapters, reports, and blog posts, and has presented her work at international conferences around the world, including the European Climate Change Adaptation Conference and the annual conference of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. So a couple of heavy-hitting economists, and just to make clear the relationship here, Clean Energy Group contracted with the Applied Economics Clinic to perform the economic analysis that is makes up the backbone of the report. It is presented in its original form of 3 white papers as appendices in the report. So if you have the report and you want to kind of follow along with Liz and Bryndis's presentation, you'll find their material in the appendices. I will be speaking to the body of the report, which is more directed toward policymakers and about the new policy in Massachusetts and its implications for other states. So we'll start with that, and then we'll go right into the economics. Next slide, please. Okay, and I will be advancing these, so I'm going to do that now. Okay, if I can get the slide to advance, I will.
You might need to click on it. There you go.
Okay, thank you. So, as I said, we're introducing this report, which is released today. It's titled Energy Storage, the New Efficiency, How States Can Use Efficiency Funds to Support Battery Storage and Flatten Costly Demand Peaks. The report really does several things, and I wanted to give you an idea of what it does and what we'll be covering in this presentation. And again, I can't get this, there we go. So the report first explains how Massachusetts incorporated battery storage into its efficiency plan and how other states can do the same. And we're going to talk about why that's important. It's really the first time that a state has legislatively incorporated peak demand reduction as an efficiency goal and as a part of its efficiency plan, and incorporated battery storage as a peak demand reducing measure into its efficiency plan. And that's very important for the future of storage as well as for the future of efficiency. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to discuss issues and best practices in designing incentives for battery storage within an efficiency plan. We're going to introduce battery storage cost-benefit analysis, and this is going to be really picked up in the second part of this presentation by Liz and Bryndis, because they're the economists that worked on this. And we're also going to talk about some of their groundbreaking work in assigning for the first time dollar values to 7 non-energy benefits of energy storage. And these include things like avoided outages, higher property values, job creation, less land used, so for power plant development. So these are additional benefits that were not considered when Massachusetts considered the cost effectiveness of batteries, but perhaps should have been and should certainly be considered in future cost benefit analysis. So I want to step back for a minute and sort of talk about where this fits into the entire policy landscape for state policy on storage. So typically states go through a kind of a 3-step process here. First step is usually studies or roadmaps on energy storage. Many states have done this, including Massachusetts. And this is where the state basically says, okay, we're going to take a year or two and we're going to kind of look at what other states have done and look at the research and the science, and we're going to come up with some kind of report on the opportunities and barriers in our state. Second step usually is grants and demonstration projects. Now, this starts to become important because it demonstrates the technology. It allows everyone to see that battery storage actually works and can work within various kinds of programs and applications. Many states have also done this. Third step is getting into longer term programs. And this is where you start to get support for market development. And it's important to move down this progression or through this progression of policy steps, because if you want markets to develop, you really have to get into longer term programs. And that includes utility procurement targets, rebates, tax incentives, adders, and so forth. And importantly, and the topic of this presentation, putting storage into the state's energy efficiency plan. And Massachusetts is the only state to date that has done this in a sort of comprehensive way, policy-driven way. So we're going to talk about how that happened. There were basically two conditions that needed to be met before storage could be introduced into the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Plan. The first step was redefining efficiency. Generally, efficiency traditionally has been thought of as using fewer electrons, and that's great. That's a good definition. But now there is arising a new type of efficiency, which can be described as peak demand reduction. And that needs to be incorporated into an expanded definition of efficiency, and it requires new types of technologies. Traditional efficiency technologies like weather stripping and lighting and efficient appliances don't shift peaks. They reduce net consumption. We'll talk about that in a minute. But redefining efficiency is an important first step. The second important step was showing that storage is cost effective, because like most states, Massachusetts has cost effectiveness screens that have to be met before public money can be spent. And so in order to incorporate a new technology or set of technologies into a program like an energy efficiency program, those have to first pass cost effectiveness screens, and that's very important. And that's why you have to get the economics work done. So taking these one at a time. Redefining efficiency. Normally, under the old traditional definition of efficiency as using fewer electrons, storage doesn't fare very well because there are round-trip losses. Storage doesn't generate, it simply stores and releases electricity, and so you're not using less. Redefining efficiency to include peak demand reduction opens up the efficiency world and includes and begins to allow storage to play as a technology that's very well suited to shifting peak demand, something that traditional passive efficiency measures don't do. So the key concept here is not all load hours should be valued the same. If you look at the chart on the left, traditional efficiency reduces the overall consumption across the day or across the demand curve. It doesn't shift peaks. The peak is still where it was. It's a little lower, and that's good because you're using less power, but the peak is still in the same spot. If you look at the chart, graphic on the right, peak demand reduction does something completely different. It doesn't reduce net consumption, but it moves the peak. It reduces the load at a high demand time, and it moves that load or demand to a low demand time. And this is very important because peaks are incredibly costly across the entire system. Now, this chart is from the Massachusetts State of Charge report, which was a report that was jointly commissioned by Department of Energy Resources and Mass CEC, the two energy agencies there. And this report found that 40% of the total annual cost of electricity in the state is attributable to the top 10% of demand hours. So what that means is that nearly half the cost of electricity in Massachusetts over the entire year is due to just 10% of the hours in that year. that means the entire energy system is sized to meet these occasional peaks. And this is a very inefficient way to run a system. The inefficiency can be seen in the white space. So you have a system sized to meet occasional peaks, but much of the time, you're not operating at those peak levels. In other words, demand isn't that high. So as a result, you have a lot of excess capacity, both in generation and transmission and distribution, that's there just to make sure you can meet those occasional peaks. This is why peak demand is costly and why shifting peak demand is a valuable service. So Massachusetts took a number of steps to redefine efficiency. And here are a few of those. This isn't an exhaustive list, but in 2008, the Green Communities Act required that efficiency program administrators seek all available energy efficiency and demand reduction resources. In 2016, the State of Charge report noted that storage was firmly covered by the intent of the Green Communities Act, and that the Energy Efficiency Investment Plan, the 3-year efficiency plan, identified peak demand reduction as an area of particular interest, and that storage could be deployed through this existing process. In 2018, the Act to Advance Clean Energy specifically allowed the use of energy efficiency funds to support the deployment of energy storage if the storage system installed at a customer's premises provided sustainable peak load reductions. So these are examples of a state that is legislatively making concrete steps to include the concept of peak demand reduction in its efficiency program, and to include storage as a technology that can achieve peak demand reduction. Now, once that's accomplished, the next step is to show that storage is cost-effective and thereby eligible for these programs. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because this is the topic of Liz and Bryndis's presentation, but I will say that back in earlier in 2018, CEG contracted with Applied Economics Clinic to do a cost-benefit analysis of energy storage, specifically for the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Program, which was then under development. The findings were that the benefit-cost ratio for storage was somewhere in the range of 2.8 to 3.4, meaning that for every dollar that you spent on storage, you would get back anywhere from $2 to $3.50 in benefits, thereby showing that the benefits outweigh the costs. Excuse me. This finding was presented to the agencies and the program administrators in Massachusetts. The utility program administrators then went and did their own cost-benefit analysis and came up with their own numbers. And again, I won't go into these in detail because it will be covered later in the presentation, but just to say that their results were ranging from 0 to 6.2. So in other words, they found that they agreed, in most cases, battery storage behind the meter at a customer's premise in a residential or commercial setting would pass the cost effectiveness test. I want to say a few words about the incentive structure that is being developed to support the deployment of energy storage within the efficiency plan in Massachusetts. This isn't the only way to do it. It's the way that the program administrators in Massachusetts have chosen to do it, and the DPU has approved. And basically, the important point here is that the incentive being provided is not for installing energy storage. The incentive is for performance. It's essentially really not an incentive, it's really a payment for performance. And it's a payment for the performance of load reduction. So the customer can buy a battery and install it, and then sign a contract with the utility. It's a 5-year contract, and the utility will send us a signal at peak demand times, which the customer has the choice to respond to or not. And if they choose to respond, they will discharge their battery during those peak hours. And at the end of the season or the year, they would then get compensated based on how much they reduced their load during peak times. This is available to residential and commercial customers. New storage is eligible with or without renewable generation. And it's important to note that the discharge signal is sent in a 3-hour block. And that's important because it helps to determine how much incentive is going to be paid at the end of the season. Also want to mention that heat loans are available for storage. These are 0% interest loans. And so that's important because the state actually did, as well as an incentive, put some form of low-cost financing in place. So as an example of the project economics, a customer installs a 60 kilowatt battery, signs up with the utility, responds to dispatch calls, which are 3 hours in duration. Assuming you have a 60 kilowatt hour battery, the best you can do in terms of average response over 3 hours is 20 kilowatts per hour. The payout or compensation is then based on that 20 kilowatt per hour average load reduction. And the incentive rate for this particular program is $100. So you multiply the 20 kilowatts per hour average times $100, you come up with $2,000. That's for the summer program. Then there's a winter program where the rate is $25. And so you add all this up. At the end of the year, you've earned $2,500 from allowing the use of your battery to reduce peaks. And over a 5-year contract, you could see that could actually add up to something that would help you pay for that battery. It's important to note also that there's nothing in the program that prevents the customer from participating in other incentive programs and other applications. So you could also qualify for a smart solar rebate with a storage adder. You can net meter excess solar. You can engage in demand charge management behind the meter and other things. The anticipated results of this program, on the whole, it's a 3-year energy efficiency plan. The incentive payments are estimated to add up to about $13 million, and the expected results are about 34 megawatts of new behind-the-meter storage being deployed. Now, it's not a perfect plan. There are some shortcomings. Notably, there is a glaring lack of low-income provisions. There is an income-eligible category in the efficiency plan in Massachusetts, but there are no offerings in that category by any of the utilities. We would highly recommend that they address this and correct this in the next iteration of the plan. There's also no upfront rebate. There are other omissions which result in the storage cost benefit numbers likely being too low, which Liz and Bryndis will talk about. And there are other issues as well. However, on the whole, this is a big step in a good direction, and we think other states, and we meaning Clean Energy Group, believes that other states should take note and look to do the same or something similar in their energy efficiency plans. And so here's sort of a list, a checklist of what states should do, and it's a pretty simple series of steps. 1, expand the definition of efficiency to include peak demand reduction. If anyone's followed the duck curve from California, which we're now seeing the exact same curve show up in New England, you know that the more solar comes on the grid in the middle of the day, the more it depresses electricity sales from the grid during midday, and the more steep ramping events there are at the end of the day where peakers have to ramp up and power plants have to ramp up as the solar generation falls off at the same time as demand peaks. This is causing problems, and energy storage is one of the key technologies to address it. Peak demand reduction should be part of energy efficiency plans because it is a growing and very important key service to increase efficiency across the entire electricity system. Secondly, fully integrate demand reduction measures like battery storage into state energy efficiency plans. That means make it eligible. Third, develop storage or demand reduction incentives within the efficiency program, and these should include three basic elements: an upfront rebate, performance incentive, access to financing. There's reasons for all three of these. I won't go into them in detail, but take a look at the report. The incentives should include adders and or carve-outs for low-income customers because they need cost reductions and resiliency more than anybody else, but they're typically the most difficult to serve with new clean energy technologies, and so we shouldn't leave them behind. Utility ownership should be limited. In other words, customers should be able to own the batteries, or third-party developers and aggregators should be able to own the batteries. And third-party developers should be able to participate in other ways: marketing the program, providing private financing, providing lease and PPA models, aggregating capacity to meet program goals. These are all aspects of a vibrant, dynamic market that we would like to see develop under these sorts of incentives. And finally, states should adopt, adapt, and build on the economics analysis that will be presented here and is in the report. This diagram from Rocky Mountain Institute shows that behind the meter storage is capable of providing more services to more stakeholder groups than storage on the transmission system or storage on the distribution system. The problem is that there are no markets yet to compensate storage owners for most of these services. In order for those markets to develop, we need to know what those we need to start calculating and analyzing these services. What are they worth, and how do you get compensated, and how does the state recognize these services and incorporate them into incentive programs to kickstart these markets? So just to conclude here, Massachusetts is the leading energy state for energy efficiency 3 years running in the ACEEE scorecard that they produce. It is certainly not the only state that has a significant and serious energy efficiency program. In fact, most states do. The Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Plan is a $2 billion investment. If you look at all the states in the nation, it adds up to about $9 billion. So this is an enormous resource that needs to be opened up to new technologies. And this is not heresy. The state energy efficiency funds have traditionally incorporated new technologies to address new efficiency applications throughout their history. In fact, it's one of the best practices that's called out by the EPA in its handbooks for energy efficiency. Things change, the grid changes, technology advances, and including new technology. It's as simple as moving from a CFL to an LED. The new technology is better, so you incorporate it. And we see batteries as the next step in this progression. So I will conclude my presentation now and turn this over to Liz Stanton and Bryndis Woods to go through the economics. And then we will get to your questions, as many of them as we can, after the second half of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Todd, and my thanks also to everyone who is joining us for the webinar today. I'm Liz Stanton, and I'm the director of the Applied Economics Clinic, and My colleague Bryndis and I are going to be talking a little bit about two white papers that we released this week about battery storage. One looking at the costs and benefits of battery storage in Massachusetts, and the other zooming in on non-energy benefits of storage. The Applied Economics Clinic is based in Somerville, Massachusetts. We're an independent nonprofit consulting group, and we provide expert services mostly to advocacy groups in environment and consumer issues, while providing on-the-job training for a new generation of technical experts. Todd has covered most of this background. We had released an earlier white paper assessing Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Program administrators' earlier April draft of their 3-year plan and the battery benefit cost assessment that was in that plan. In our more recent white papers, we're looking at the final version of their plan and the benefit cost assessment in that. And there was a lot of change between those two versions, which we'll get into a little bit in response to our July critique and other critiques and comments. The program administrators made important changes to how they were calculating benefit cost for batteries. Todd showed this image earlier. This is looking at the program administrator's own assessment of the benefit cost ratios for all advanced demand management measures that are in their plans. And the way to read this for anyone who's not familiar with it is that in a benefit cost ratio, as long as the ratio is 1 or higher, then you're looking at a measure where the benefits are greater than the costs. But if it's lower than 1, then the costs are greater than the benefits. And you can see most of the numbers here are 1 or higher. The yellow rows are specifically storage measures. But in terms of approval as an all cost-effective measure, the approval level in Massachusetts is at the program level. So here, the Advanced Demand Management Program, or 3 programs, residential, income eligible, and commercial industrial, are what's assessed. And in there, for the program assessment of benefit cost, it combines all of the measures in that program, all of their benefits, all of their costs, and then any program level costs of administration. So almost across the board for the 4 Massachusetts program administrators, we see higher than 1 benefit cost ratios for advanced demand management programs. There's one exception in 2019 for Unitil in the residential program, but aside from that, all of these programs are passing the benefit cost test. There are some individual measures that are lower than 1, but that isn't where that isn't the level at which the assessment is done. The 4 program administrators in Massachusetts put forward different plans for battery storage programs as part of the 3-year energy efficiency plan. And this table is reviewing what those different plans were. So again, there's 3 different programs: residential, income eligible, and commercial industrial. And then each of the 4 program administrators is submitting plans that have some variation in how they're structured. Cape Light Compact, the programs that they submitted were ones in which the program administrator, Cape Light, would have provided the batteries. That program was not approved by the Massachusetts Utility Commission. For the other programs, Eversource, National Grid, Unitil, the batteries are BYO, bring your own battery. The customer buys the battery and then is enrolled into an incentive program based on the performance of that battery at peak. Some of these are recorded a little bit differently in the program administrator's calculations of how they're looking at benefits and costs. Some of them are included in terms of an aggregate across all of the batteries in the system, and sometimes they look at it as the costs and benefits of a single battery. So that distinction is more about understanding what the program administrators have put forward as the benefits and costs, and the number of measures that they're expecting to see over the next 3 years. Here we have the summer capacity savings based on advanced demand management for the 4 program administrators. Again, the yellow is the storage specifically, and if you add all of this up, it comes to 34 megawatts in capacity as the amount in 2021. Without the Cape Light Compact amount, which wasn't approved, it's about 30 megawatts. There were a number of changes from the April draft to the final version that was submitted and approved in October, submitted in October, approved in January of this year. A couple of the things that we want to flag as being positive changes are the way in which the program administrators are looking at peak shifting. The new treatment in the final plan is a lot more complex. It's breaking things down by winter and summer, charging and discharging. It's a lot easier to see in their calculations what assumptions they're making, and from our assessment, is a cleaner way to do this and an improvement over the previous method. Also, and the second one is an improvement in general to the final plan over the April plan for both efficiency and advanced demand measures. In the previous version and in previous 3-year plans, Massachusetts was not including a non-embedded or an externality cost of CO2. It was being valued at $0. In the final plan, new research had been conducted that was Massachusetts specific, and the final plan is now including a $35 per short ton CO2 cost as the externality value. So that $35 is on top of the cost of energy. We have a few remaining concerns in the final version of the plan with regards to the treatment of battery storage, cost, and benefits. We're going to go through each one of these in turn, starting with the treatment of peak emissions. The program administrators are making the assumption that peak emissions are actually lower than off-peak emissions, which is the opposite of what's assumed by ISO New England. This difference comes from the avoided cost study that is done for New England. The most recent avoided energy supply cost study for New England was done last year in 2018, and its underlying modeling produced the result that, based on modeling, that off-peak emissions were higher than on-peak emissions. The ISO New England emissions reports show the opposite. In neither case is it shown to be a very big difference, but the direction is different here of what's assumed, and it comes up as an issue to be reviewed in further avoided cost studies. Another issue having to do with peak and off-peak is the definition of peak and off-peak. So the way that peak and off-peak is defined for the purpose of estimating benefits and costs of storage and of anything in Massachusetts is using a standard definition of peak being 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. every weekday except for holidays. that definition is used throughout, and that becomes that for many purposes and for energy efficiency, that might be a fine definition, but when we're talking about storage measures that are specifically designed to be called for discharge at peak hours, it becomes a very big block of time that's being called peak in modeling. So it's a place where the modeling of peak usage is very different from real world peak usage. And that can be observed by looking closely at modeling results for New England for what were the 10% of hours that had the highest energy price, or what were the 10% of hours that had the highest energy demand. And by those definitions, you get very different results of the number of hours that would be called peak and off-peak and the prices that those hours would have than with the current definition that's being used of all day long of every weekday. Okay. Second. Right. Two final concerns before we move on to talking about non-energy benefits. And these both have to do with the way that capacity is valued in the program administrator's benefit cost assessments. So for summer capacity, we have the concern that it may be undervalued in their calculations. The program administrators, based on, again, numbers that are coming from the avoided energy supply costs of 2018, are making a broad assumption that most storage and other demand response measures are only being called in 10% of peak hours. We don't argue that measures are going to be called in a number lower than 100% of those hours, but are looking for a more rigorous treatment of how many of those hours is the appropriate share to use here. The 10% comes from a study that was done for Maryland in the PJM region and was done specific to demand response. So it isn't specific to New England. It isn't specific to storage. We'd like to see some more detailed information being applied here to get a better evaluation of summer capacity. For winter values, winter capacity, and this is a kind of a difference in definition, winter capacity is valued at $0 in New England. And that's because the way the capacity markets work in New England, capacity is set based on summer peak, not based on winter peak. So the technical, based on a technical definition, there is no value to winter capacity in New England. However, there's a great deal of value to supplying winter electric reliability in New England when you think about it more broadly. The PAs in their plan acknowledge this difference and note that a study and more research will be done on winter reliability to do a better job of assigning a value to what is it worth to Massachusetts to reduce winter peaks. But in the meantime, winter reliability is getting a $0 value in all of the benefit cost assessments that you've seen here. The final concern that we want to discuss is about the absence of non-energy values in these assessments, and I'm going to turn it over to Bryndis to go over that.
Thanks, Liz. As both Todd and Liz have mentioned, the final thing that we did in our analysis was we did a preliminary assessment of these non-energy benefits of battery storage. And I want to start out my discussion of these by emphasizing the preliminary nature of this assessment. We are not claiming that these 7 non-energy benefits are exhaustive of all non-energy benefits, nor are we saying that these are the final values, but rather we're presenting this assessment as a starting point for discussion about how to include these kinds of benefits in benefit cost assessments of battery storage. So the issue with not including non-energy benefits is that it has the same effect as assuming they have a $0 value, when clearly that's not the case for these benefits. This slide is distinguishing the difference between what is an energy benefit and what is a non-energy benefit. But actually, the first non-energy benefit we assessed does that really well on its own. So I'm just going to move on and use that as a way to highlight the difference. So avoided power outages was the first non-energy benefit that we assessed. And this is a great example of the difference between an energy and a non-energy benefit, because it was also assessed as an energy benefit by the program administrators. So when they assess the energy benefit of avoided power outages, they're trying to get at the benefit to the energy system itself that is conferred through reductions in the cost of supplying energy. The way they did that, the program administrators, was to use the value of lost load as a proxy for the system benefit of avoided power outages. In our analysis, which I encourage you to look at for more detail, we do two things. One is that we have a detailed critique of the use of VOL, which is the value of lost load, in the benefit cost analysis that was conducted, but I'm not going to go into that here. Secondly, we argue that the value of lost load is used as a proxy for the energy system benefit, but is in fact the non-energy benefit. That value is solicited from ratepayers themselves about the value of avoiding an energy interruption. So that non-energy benefit is conferred directly to participants themselves, not to the energy system. So think the value to a hospital of being able to continue to run normal operations during a power outage, for example. And so the values for these non-energy benefits that we found in our analysis, you can see off to the right in these little text boxes. And the data sources that we used for all of those values are included in our analysis as well. The second non-energy benefit that we assessed was higher property values. So installing battery storage can confer a benefit in terms of increasing thermal comfort, so an ability to continue to run heating and cooling systems during a power outage, for example, and marketability for landlords. And these non-energy benefits are actually calculated in Massachusetts for energy efficiency programs. And the benefit is conferred in much the same way for battery storage as it is for energy efficiency. So those values off to the right, the 5,300 or so for low-income single-family, those values are taken from the Massachusetts non-energy benefit analysis for energy efficiency measures. The third non-energy benefit we looked at was avoided fines. In this case, we had sort of one case study that we used to be demonstrative of how this benefit could manifest and does manifest, which was that in 2011, fall of 2011, Massachusetts experienced some pretty strong winter storms that caused widespread power outages. And there were fines levied the following year on 3 Massachusetts utilities, totaling over $24 million. So those are the kinds of things that could be avoided with increased battery storage on the Massachusetts energy system. The fourth non-energy benefit was avoided collections and terminations. And again, this benefit manifests in a very similar way as it does for energy efficiency, which is to say more energy efficiency or alternatively more battery storage reduces the need for costly new peaker power plants, which makes it easier for ratepayers to pay their bills because they're not paying the costs of building those expensive new power plants. The fifth, again, is another benefit that is manifesting very similarly for battery storage as it does for energy efficiency, which is that more energy efficiency or more battery storage results in fewer power outages. And power outages are risky in terms of safety concerns, so fires and things like that causes utilities to need to make calls. That benefit, again, is taken from the non-energy assessment for energy efficiency. The sixth non-energy benefit we looked at was job creation, and the values we got for this benefit are from that state of charge report that Todd mentioned earlier from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center and Department of Energy Resources. And they had estimated in that report the total value of battery storage and the number of jobs that could be created over the entire time period that they looked at. And we calculated the number of jobs and dollars per megawatt from those figures. And finally, the seventh and last non-energy benefit that we looked at was less land being needed for peaker power plants. So as you add battery storage, you have less need to build these expensive and land-intensive peaker power plants. And this benefit actually would be the same for energy efficiency, but was not assessed in the energy efficiency non-energy benefit analysis. In order to come up with this number that you see here, 12.4 acres per megawatt, we simply did a literature review. So we found that the average natural gas-fired peaker plant takes up 12.4 acres of land, and if you avoid needing to build that land, that's 12.4 acres of land that you could be using for some other purpose that benefits society more broadly. So with that, I would like to thank all of you, and on this slide you can see how to contact both Liz and myself and links to the two papers that we have been discussing here. And I'll turn it back over to Todd and Samantha.
Great, thanks very much to both of you. And we do have a lot of questions. Let's see how many we can get to, and let's keep the answers brief if we can. So first thing, somebody comments, 34 megawatt goal seems very modest. I agree. Do either of you have any comment on the just the overall kind of size of the investment and expected outcome related to the size of the entire program or the size of the state's load, for example?
I'll just say that the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Advisory Council's consultant team estimated the capacity for storage peak shaving as 84 megawatts.
Right. Okay. So, and we should say the advisory team, the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council is sort of works with the utility program administrators to help kind of get the plan put together and then recommends it to the DPU. And they are advisory, but they also have advisors to them who are more technical people who look into these things and do analysis. And they're the ones that came up with the 84 megawatts as a target?
Yes.
Okay. Another question, how would you value winter reliability? This is an interesting question because in fact, DOER and the EEAC have been calling for winter reliability values, and I believe there's an effort underway to do that. Liz, can you speak to that?
Yeah, we haven't done the research yet, and it's something I've definitely been thinking about. I think that there's evidence that such a value exists in every program related to winter reliability that the ISO has, and also in the conversations around whether and to what degree new pipelines are needed in New England versus alternative ways of shaving peak in winter. Both of those things have very specific implied winter reliability values, but the question of how best to calculate that is one that I don't think anybody has addressed yet.
Okay, thank you. I think and I believe that there is an effort underway on the part of the utilities and some of the agencies in Massachusetts to address it, supposedly this year, I think. Several people asked to get some more clarity or to go over again the project economics example. It is a little confusing. I'll try to clarify it briefly. As we understand it, and these things are, as I said earlier, some of the details are still being figured out by the utilities. So please don't go try to go to the bank with this. But as we understand it at this point, the way this is supposed to be done is that the customer responds to a series of 3-hour dispatch signals across the season. So perhaps you've bought and installed a battery, and it's a 60 kilowatt battery, and you sign up, you sign a 5-year contract with your utility, and they're going to signal you and say, we would like you to discharge the battery between the hours of 2 and 5 p.m. And then you do that, and assuming that the battery is fully charged at the beginning of that period and that you fully discharge it, and those are assumptions, those aren't going to be the case all the time, and probably for most systems, but just to get an optimal, not optimal, a maximum possible compensation, let's assume that those things are true. And so you've got 60 kilowatt hour battery, it's fully charged. You discharge it over the 3-hour period of the dispatch call. The average of that per hour is 20 kilowatts per hour, 20, 40, 60, right? So what they're doing is they're taking and they're averaging that over the course of the season or the year. So if you responded to every single call with a completely full battery and you completely discharged it for every single call, the best you can do for an average discharge is 20 kilowatts hourly. They then multiply that by the incentive rate. In the case of the targeted dispatch system for the summer, it's $100 a kilowatt. So you multiply 20 kilowatts times $100, and you come up with your $2,000 rebate or incentive payment. So I hope that clarifies it. And the key here is the duration of the dispatch call. And that's why in the report, we talk about the importance of two things. One is the definition of peak, and Liz talked about this a bit, making sure that you have a reasonable definition, that peak isn't defined as everything between 9 a.m. and 11 p.m. on every weekday. And also the duration of those calls be short enough to allow the technology to actually do something productive and allow people to get compensated. So in other words, if you had a 2-hour dispatch call, that same 60 kilowatt hour battery could then provide an average of 30 kilowatts of load reduction per hour instead of 20, and then you get more compensation. So the duration of dispatch really is important. I'm sorry it's a little confusing, but I hope that's a little clearer now than it was before. Okay, what is the relationship between active demand management program and the proposed clean peak standard? Good question. CPS is still in development. It's pretty early on, and I'm not sure there's a definite relationship yet. Liz or Bryndis, do you have anything to add on that?
I would have said the same, yeah.
Okay, the only thing I guess I would say is presumably one could, if one owned a battery, participate in both somehow, but I'm not sure. The Clean Peak is such an early stage of development that it's really hard to say. Okay. Let's see. people are interested in the land use issue and retrofits of storage occurring on property already developed. Liz or Bryndis, can you comment any further on the land use savings and sort of how that was, how you figured that out?
Sure. There is such a wide variation in what land might be used. We were going for kind of a maximum possible value. Most residential storage systems do not take up any outdoor space or any at all. And so in that we're kind of saying we're comparing it to what space would be needed to build 1 megawatt's worth of a gas power plant. So yes, the 12.4 acres is referring to that gas power plant per megawatt that would be avoided. Of course, as the person who is submitting the question is suggesting, the power plant could be built on different kinds of land. And we're not getting into that value here, where is it built on, brownfield? Is it built on a previous power plant? What is it built on? We're just giving an estimate of how much land area it takes to build a gas power plant.
Okay, and assuming that because this is an efficiency program, batteries will be installed behind meters on land that's already occupied and thereby not requiring any additional footprint, which seems to make sense.
A bit more detail about that of assumptions of how much footprint it could take, but for residential systems that it takes no footprint is a pretty good assumption.
Right.
Yeah, okay. There's more detail in our analysis itself. So we did find there's not a lot of information out there in the literature about the land footprint of utility scale battery storage, but we did find 3. And you can find that in table 8 of our analysis. But even for utility scale battery storage, we found that the average acres per megawatt was less than 0.2. Yeah. 0.02, excuse me. So it's tiny, it's very, very small, and we could assume for residential that it would be effectively 0. Think of a Tesla power wall, for example. It doesn't take any space at all, it just goes on your wall.
Right. Okay. And actually one thing I would add for the peakers is that peaker plants, not always, but they're often in urban areas, close to load, and they thereby are often on land that is fairly high value land. In other words, we're not necessarily talking about plants that are out in the middle of the woods somewhere. We're talking about plants that are on land that has a pretty high value. There's a lot of alternate uses for that land, and so if there are numerous studies on the value of urban land, and I've looked at some of them. Urban land in Massachusetts is quite valuable. Somebody wants to make, and we're going to have to wrap this up, so I think this is the last one. Somebody wants to make a comment that retrospective pay for performance compensation as a model makes projects unfinanceable. It's better to come up with a steady compensation stream with a model-based approach for a fixed period. Are there examples of that for incorporating energy efficiency in other states? I don't know about the examples, but I want to ask the economists in terms of financing, project financeability. I would have thought, and we actually made the case or tried to make the case that a rebate, an upfront rebate, or at least some combination of rebate and performance incentive would have been very helpful in terms of getting projects actually built and batteries installed. Do you guys have any comment on the different models of compensation or incentives?
Yeah, I do. So the Massachusetts heat loan program that Todd explained is critical to making not only storage but other eligible technologies related to efficiency possible for homeowners in Massachusetts. It's a zero interest loan for 7 years. It's incredibly important for equity concerns with energy efficiency and storage, but it doesn't solve everything, and it should be noted that the heat loan is only people that have a certain level of credit would be eligible for a heat loan, which closes it down to a lot of low-income families. That existence of that program in Massachusetts has made it possible to not have these programs focus on having upfront rebates, although combining the two things would be really helpful. In states that don't have a mechanism for that, or where storage wouldn't be eligible for a zero interest loan mechanism, then yes, the upfront financing is critical to make this possible for homeowners and small businesses.
Great, thank you. And we should just mention again that the low income or income eligible component of this particular plan is lacking, and this is just one of the ways in which that can be seen. And that's something that should really be addressed. So I want to thank our presenters, Liz Stanton and Bryndis Woods from the Applied Economics Clinic. Hope that everybody enjoyed the webinar. I apologize that we didn't get to more of your questions. If you don't have the report, it's out today. And please get it. You can also review this webinar and download the slides. They will be made available on our website, and Samantha can give you more information on that as well as upcoming events. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Todd. So if you're looking for information about the report that we discussed today or about our upcoming webinars, the best place to find that information is on our website, cleanegroup.org. You can see the URL on your screen here. You can find this report, upcoming webinars, past webinars, and a lot more at that website. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We hope to see you at the next one. Bye.